Hi, my name is Rebecca Hill, and I want to talk a little bit about my experiences with mental health and autism, and why I think the way mental health is dealt with in America is absolute garbage. Ignore the chickens in the background if you hear any clucking. I don't have a script for this, and I'm a little nervous. I don't know why. For me, I guess it's just hard to talk about my feelings about. These are hard things that are a source of trauma, I guess, for me. And I'm in a place in my life where I'm trying to figure out myself. And I'm on this journey of trying to get myself help, and it's it's hard. It's hard to talk about these kind of things. So if I stop and start and pause, and otherwise I'm not as coherent as I would like, I'm sorry. I'm trying to be as emotionally honest as possible about this, because it's just, maybe it'll help somebody. Maybe somebody's going through something similar, or whatnot. So, first off, with my history, I'm 36 years old. I was diagnosed with autism spectrum when I was 30, even though I had suspected it for quite a while. I also have depression and anxiety, as well as PTSD and complex PTSD because of certain experiences, which I'll talk about later. And on my mental health journey started, well, not even mental health, I guess autism and the mental health, they kind of are intersectional and kind of cross at certain points, if that makes sense. But from a very young age, I exhibited behavior that my mother was like, something's a little off. And I was her fifth child, and he was trying very hard, I remember, throughout my childhood to figure out why I was different. And every doctor that she encountered was like, well, every child is different, don't worry about it. And they were very dismissive of her. And she was trying so hard to fight for me, because I didn't, at a young age, you don't necessarily know how to fight for yourself and be an advocate for your own mental health at that age. She had a hard, and now I realize from doing my own research as an adult that I was back in all the research when I was a kid for autism was geared towards the male manifestations of autism. Whereas now we realize, the scientific and psychological community realizes, that autism spectrums and all the disorders and all that manifest differently in girls. And looking back, I exhibited so many textbook examples of what autism manifests itself in girls. But my mom didn't know that at the time. I remember I went to this evaluation, I think when I was 10 years old, where they were trying to test for Fragile X. And I went to this somewhere in Indiana, and they did this. I don't recall much about what they did. I think they did some blood tests, and they talked to me. I don't think they did any like MRIs or CAT scans of like my brain activity. I think it was just blood tests and talking. But reading back as an adult, didn't get to read it until I was much older. The report they gave, they're like, she has depression. Looking at it, but at the time, I grew up in I would say, lower middle class. I think there were some times where we were actually dirt poor, and there are other times where we had more money. But and I also had a lot of other medical problems besides these psychological things. And I was in a family of 6 kids, and my dad was getting his PhD, so we didn't have a lot of money. And looking back at that evaluation, where very clearly it says I was manifesting symptoms of depression and anxiety, but nothing was done about it, both in school or by my parents themselves. And I don't know if that was necessarily a product of how mental illness was perceived and thought of back in the 90s and the 2000s. But it just wasn't something that was talked about. It wasn't something that was necessarily addressed. I do remember going to a counselor, like the school counselor in middle school, because I was exhibiting kind of depressive tendencies, but it wasn't really structured like therapy. It was, and at the time I was given a diagnosis of ADD because my mom was she was working for at the time, someone who was autistic. She was an in-home aide for him, and she's like, I think my daughter has autism. And like I said before, nobody really thought that was the case, but they did give me a diagnosis of ADD. And I also had speech therapy because I had problems with that, and also I was deaf as a child because of adenoids blocking everything. So there's all these things that were delaying certain things, and so that's what doctors were trying to say. Hey, that's why she isn't, normal, because of all these other things. When looking back, it was autism, depression, anxiety, whatever. I also got beat up a lot as a kid for being different, and I also verbally abused. And there was a police report filed one time, but nothing was ever done with it. And you would think in the school's mind, okay, she's experiencing bullying and some sort of trauma. Maybe we should get her some, psychological help to help her deal with that. But no. I don't know if that's something that happens even now in the school system. And we all know I think the school in general, they're trying to be more aware of bullying and doing things about it, but still not a lot. I don't think it's enough. The anti-bullying campaigns. Either way, I was experiencing psychological trauma that wasn't being addressed. And my parents didn't have enough money to send me to a psychologist privately, even if they would even have thought to think of it at all, because the cultural expectations and standards at that point, that was just not something you talked about or something you dealt with. And so going into middle school and high school, again, now looking back, and I'm like, oh honey child, you were a hot mess. And I was trying my best to cope, but and it wasn't until I got to college and things just kind of went. I basically had a mental breakdown, I think, when I was I had kind of mini ones, like my freshman and sophomore year. But it finally all came ahead to my junior year, where I just completely shut down. And I was in the middle of college, and yeah, that was not a great experience. And I had a friend who had depression and anxiety. He's like, yeah, you should, go and get talk to a therapist. And thankfully at my school therapy, they had free counselors, and so I did that, and it kind of helped. And then I was put on medication, kind of helped. And I should also mention at this point that I also was a victim of sexual assault when I was 17, that I didn't really talk about, and I was trying to deal with that. But all in all, this made for a very chaotic experience. I did graduate from college, but by the skin in my teeth. Um, and honestly, there's a lot of trauma associated from being in college too. And like, I think about going back to school for like a master's, and I just immediately like shut down emotionally because it was such a hard time for me, um, emotionally, and also dealing with all my other physical and disabilities. One thing I ran into, the problem I ran into when I was in college was there were some times where I would miss appointments. Like, first off, there was a severe, you had to plan your psychological plans months in advance. Um, you couldn't just get like a appointment on the fly. Um, so it's sometimes you'd have to do it right at the beginning of the semester, but if you needed help in the middle of the semester, you were basically screwed. They also didn't have like psychiatrists, they just had counselors, which in some cases, for some people, is fine, but I feel like I needed a psychiatrist. I know it's mainly just because they can figure out what meds are right for you, because everybody reacts differently to meds, but I was getting meds from my GP and from the student health center at the time. And some worked and some didn't, but I'm like, would it have been better to see a psychiatrist? And I'm also running into the same problem here. I live in Utah, and like, there's like no psychiatrists here. It's mainly just counselors. And anyway, that's another whole ball of wax. State of Utah is just ass backwards on a lot of things, especially when it comes to children, but also mental health and autism services. But going back to trying to get appointments, I would try my best to make appointments. Sometimes I couldn't keep them because I was so depressed. Like, if that makes sense. Like, I would be so depressed. I was already missing classes because of, my depression and anxiety and all the other traumas I was trying to deal with. But I